size and barely survived. But its survival has been important in that especially for those of us in Chicago, it's helped keep alive a vision of rank and file, unionism, more militant, anti-partnership type of organizing. And I don't think many other unions would be have done what they did, if any. It's notable that when Hartmarx was faced with a similar kind of cutback, SEIU also stepped up to the same tactic and threatened a factory occupation. I think the Republican windows made that happen by force of example. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that example being taken place elsewhere. In terms of labor leadership overall, whether they would oppose militancy, the history of the United States generally has been that they've opposed it until they've had no choice but to try to put themselves at the head of it. The United Auto Workers in the 1970s, and was on his way to becoming president of UAW, Doug Frazier, broke up a wildcat strike with baseball bats back in 1973. And that's one of the, it's one of the moments in the 1970s when it was pretty clear that the bureaucracy kind of set itself against the rank and file, and not just in UAW but across the board, basically made a conclusion that it would be in its interest institutionally to try to crush this rank and file rebellion at any cost, rather than versus trying to allow it to be, rather than risk being pushed into confrontations with capital. And that kind of dynamic repeated itself over the next number of years with some breakthroughs, as I mentioned in the teachers union, when Kerry was able to be president. So the labor union leadership it's a social layer that tries to mediate between capital and workers, and it can be pushed in either direction. If workers are organized, they can compel even the most conservative union leadership, such as the Teamsters in the mid-70s, were compelled to call a national freight strike, and it originated in wildcat actions. When employers have the upper hand and workers are not able to resist, it works the other way. We've been seeing it working mainly the other way throughout the last 35 years. I think, in previous times, the union bureaucracy has split into different wings. We have that between the AFL and the CIO. Probably noteworthy by omission was any mention here of the phenomenon of change to win, which led the AFL-CIO in 2005, not really on any clear program of trying to rework the labor movement, but mainly on a calculation by Andy Stern of SEIU and his allies that the AFL-CIO apparatus was no longer worth paying into the kind of dues that they were paying, and to prop up what they saw as declining unions that were too high down to react to reality. Therefore, we're going to go our own way and organize. And they actually had no real success in doing so outside of SEIU itself. And even there, it's more complicated than that, because it was some of their gains were in that period were achieved through political deals of the sort I mentioned earlier here in the state of Illinois. In terms of the energy sector, the bulk of coal now today is non-union. The bulk of it's actually in the West. A lot of the coal mining has been taking place in Appalachia, has been through mountaintop removal. So the United Mine Workers is actually a small player, and I think the mining disaster is a direct result of the fact of the union's marginalization, because it really, the UMW's resurgence in the 60s and 70s was precisely around the issue of black lung benefits for miners and also workplace safety, and the employer's ability to shift to non-union production, and has been able to allow them to get, and as well as since Reagan came in the 1980s, a very light regulatory regime, to put it mildly, from the federal government has allowed them to play all kinds of games with workplace safety. And we're seeing the same evidence of the same in the oil industry, which I know less about. Now, there's a bigger question about
you push the mic a little closer.
Sure. Around the bigger question of industrial restructuring and how to understand that. I would not agree that capitalism was kind of organized on a white national model between 1870 and 1970. I don't think we really understand it. Capitalism has been based in core countries, primarily in Western Europe, in the United States, in Canada, since World War II in Japan as well. And we've seen a process which of something that Leon Trotsky summed up very well more than a century ago, of combined and uneven development, in which some elements of the former colonialized world have become major economic powers: China, Brazil, India. But of course, the residual military imperial power that resides in the U.S. and its allies, NATO, and so on, kind of arrests that development insofar as bring them anything to like an equal playing field. So you have a series of complicated relationships where, on the one hand, the U.S. Saw Japan as a rival and tried to constrain its imports in various ways starting in the 1980s. One solution to that, from the U.S. standpoint, was to take advantage of the new openings in China and turn China and other parts of the Pacific Rim into low-cost export platforms for U.S. capital, in a sense getting around the Japanese labor cost advantage by building its own East Asian labor cost advantage. Obviously now, that's yielded created a new situation in which China is a formidable economic competitor on many fronts, dependent on the U.S. for high-tech goods in many ways, while the U.S. absorbs some of its lower-tech merchandise. And of course, there's the complex financial relationship in which the Chinese have funded U.S. deficit spending by purchasing U.S. Treasury bills in order to help fund U.S. consumption over the last period. That relationship is under enormous strain. I think we're drifting towards trade wars on multiple fronts as a result of this crisis. It's just now taking shape, and it does present U.S. capitalists with a question about how much they want to invest in the U.S. Will they go back to a little more protectionist or in a more extreme sense, a state capitalist mode of dealing with this, or are they going to try and work with this new globalized world economy in a way that's benefited them so well in the past? Are they willing to allow the auto, but the calculation they make are very different. 50, 60 years ago, a big, massive steel industry and a big, massive auto industry were synonymous with being a big imperialist power. Today, we're not in a situation where, as we were in World War II, where to win a war you convert auto plants into building airplanes. I mean, that's impossible technologically. We have aerospace as a cutting edge technology, missiles and so forth. The steel industry goes, or it's going to be foreign owned. So what? The auto industry has more and more foreign imports. So what? The calculations for U.S. capitalists are different from a strategic sense. Let's they keep wanting to move up what they call a value chain, and so on. Now, I think while we can see that whole areas of the country have been de-industrialized, such as Detroit, other areas are being industrialized, such as north central Alabama around the auto industry. And even though the United States has lost millions of manufacturing jobs since the recession of 2001, I was surprised to see before coming here today and checking some of the statistics that manufacturing has actually added 100,000 jobs in this country over the last year. You wouldn't have expected it, but that's actually a signal of some of the economic recovery. What kind of manufacturing jobs they are, what sectors of the economy, I don't know. But the U.S. economy is still profoundly an industrial economy, and the point is that far fewer workers produce the same amount of output that their predecessors did 20, 30 years ago. The U.S. produces more steel today than it did in 1970. It produces more autos, and so on. So it's a question of productivity, and so is key. And it's also important to realize that we shouldn't, that manufacturing isn't the sole source of power for the U.S. working class. There are all kinds of ancillary areas of production without which the U.S. economy couldn't function, both in terms of white-collar, high-tech work, but also critical blue-collar employment and the logistics and transportation industry. I mean, logistics is really a fancy way of saying transportation. It's become more important than ever in the era of lean production, just-in-time production, where you don't stockpile material. It depends on modern communications, trucking, and so forth. That's one reason why corporate America was so intent on eradicating the Teamsters Union from its positions of power in the freight industry. And they're poised to try to deliver the final blows at the two remaining Teamster freight